Hello, it's me, your narrator for Sleepless Nights, ready to delve into another delightfully monotonous story from the Boring History for Sleep series. Today's topic will take us into a world of fascinating contrasts and somewhat questionable practices. We're going to explore why medieval beauty standards were brutal and impossible. Yes, we're talking about a time when beauty wasn't just a matter of aesthetics, but of survival, status, and, often, sheer pain. Before we begin our journey, turn off the light, snuggle into your soft pillow, and leave the modern world outside. If you like what you hear, feel free to give it a like and subscribe, but only if you want to. No pressure. In the comments, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I love to know how far these stories travel. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let's travel to a time when there were no Instagram filters, only arsenic and leeches to achieve the perfect look. Imagine for a moment that you wake up, not to the irritating sound of your phone's alarm, but to the distant bell of a church, a sound that dictates the rhythm of your entire life. You don't stretch to reach for your phone to check social media. Instead, perhaps you turn on a straw mattress, the cold medieval morning air nipping at your skin. And the first thing on your mind, if you are a woman of a certain social standing, is not breakfast or your to-do list for the day. It's your reflection. Not in a crystal-clear glass mirror, of course, but perhaps in a polished piece of metal, or the cloudy reflection in a basin of water. And what do you hope to see? Health? Vitality? A rosy glow on your cheeks? Not a chance. In your era, the Middle Ages, the supreme ideal of beauty, the look that everyone covets, is the appearance of someone on the verge of death. Pallor, an almost translucent paleness, was the gold standard of feminine beauty in the aristocracy. A flushed, sun-tanned skin was the indelible mark of labor, of the peasantry. It meant you spent your days under the scorching sun, bent over the fields with your hands dirty from the earth. It was the sign of poverty, of toil. A true lady, a woman of noble blood, did not work. She lived in seclusion, protected from the sun within the cold stone walls of her castle. Her skin a testament to her idleness and, therefore, her high status. The paler you were, the richer and more refined you appeared. Pallor wasn't just an aesthetic preference, it was a social statement, a walking billboard that screamed, "I don't need to work to live." This ideal was so extreme that the appearance of sickness, especially tuberculosis, which was romantically called consumption at the time, became tragically chic. Consumption gave its victim an ethereal thinness, a fever that lent a feverish glint to the eyes, and most importantly, a ghostly pallor. Poets wrote about the fragile beauty of these women, as if their proximity to the other world made them purer, more angelic. It was a morbid fascination, a romanticization of disease that turned deadly symptoms into attributes of beauty. So while poor women fought to survive real diseases, the rich tried to emulate their appearance. They didn't want the cough, the pain, and the death, of course. They just wanted the aesthetic, the visual passport to a higher level of delicacy and femininity. It was the beauty of fragility, the idea that an ideal woman was so delicate that a gust of wind could carry her away. A robust, healthy woman was seen as coarse, almost vulgar, like a beast of burden. True nobility lay in visible weakness, in looking like you spent your days reading poetry on a divan, sighing delicately, perhaps fainting from time to time for dramatic effect. And to achieve this coveted pallor, women resorted to methods that ranged from uncomfortable to downright dangerous, a preview of what we will explore later. For now, just imagine yourself in this world, where the appearance of health was a social disadvantage, and beauty was synonymous with a sickly fragility. Now that you've accepted the need to look perpetually ill, let's focus on your face, specifically the upper part of it. Forget today's tutorials on how to fill and shape your eyebrows to frame your eyes. In your new home, the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, the forehead is the true star of the show. And not just any forehead. The ideal is a high, vast, curved, and completely smooth forehead, a true dome of ivory that dominates the face. A wide forehead was considered a sign of intelligence, nobility, and purity. It was the equivalent of having a facial billboard that announced your sophistication and your place in the social hierarchy. A small or low forehead was seen as a peasant trait, associated with ignorance and an inferior lineage. To achieve this monumental look, noble women entered into a declared war against their own hair. The natural hairline, for most, was simply not high enough. The solution? Plucking. Using rudimentary tweezers, They would spend painful hours plucking hair by hair, the hair from the front of their head to create an artificially receded hairline. Imagine the pain, the skin irritation, the small red dots of blood that needed to be covered, all to push the forehead higher, creating a blank canvas that stretched almost to the top of the head. It was a painful commitment to fashion, a form of self-mutilation in the name of elegance. But the hair removal didn't stop there. Eyebrows, which we now consider essential for facial expression, were seen as a coarse interruption in the smooth landscape of the face. Therefore, they too had to go. Women would pluck their eyebrows completely or thin them until they became almost invisible arches, drawn high above their natural position. The goal was to create an appearance of perpetual surprise and innocence, an open face without the shadows that eyebrows might create. And, in some cases, the eyelashes were also plucked, following the same logic that facial hair was an animalistic and coarse feature that needed to be eradicated to achieve a celestial and pure beauty. The final result was a look that, to our modern eyes, can seem strange, almost alien-like. A face dominated by a huge, smooth forehead, without the frame of eyebrows, with eyes that seemed to float on a pale canvas. Think of the portraits of Queen Elizabeth I, with her very high forehead and lack of visible eyebrows. She was a fashion icon of her time. This practice was so widespread that headdresses and veils were designed specifically to accentuate this plucked forehead, with heart-shaped or butterfly-shaped headdresses that perched on the back of the head, leaving the vast expanse of skin on display. It was a beauty that demanded pain and dedication. As you snuggle in your bed, feel the relief of not having to grab a pair of tweezers and start remodeling your hairline. Feel the texture of your eyebrows, a small freedom that your medieval ancestors could not enjoy. They were bound to an ideal that valued absence, removal, the creation of a polished void where nature had placed hair. Now that you've achieved a cadaverous pallor and sport a vast eyebrowless forehead, let's move a little further down your ideal medieval face. It's time to smile. Or, rather, maybe not. Because what constitutes an attractive smile in your new time is drastically different from the ideal of white, perfectly aligned teeth we know today. In fact, a bright, healthy smile could be a problem. Remember, beauty is intrinsically linked to social status, and the diet of the medieval elite was beginning to have a very specific and visible effect on their teeth. Sugar, an incredibly expensive luxury imported from the East, was becoming increasingly popular among the rich. They consumed it in sweets, in savory dishes, in drinks. It was the ultimate in ostentation. The inevitable result of this sugary diet, combined with virtually non-existent dental hygiene, was cavities. Decayed, stained, and blackened teeth became an unintentional mark of wealth. If you had bad teeth, it meant you could afford sugar. Therefore, paradoxically, a smile full of blackened or missing teeth could signal your high position in society. Queen Elizabeth I, again a fashion icon, was famous for her blackened teeth, a direct result of her love for sweets. Foreign ambassadors commented on it, and far from being a shame, it was almost proof of her royal status. Having perfect white teeth could suggest you were a peasant, with a simple, sugar-free diet based on coarse bread, vegetables, and dairy, which, ironically, was much healthier for the teeth. This association between bad teeth and wealth led to a peculiar aesthetic. Women didn't necessarily seek to ruin their teeth on purpose, but there certainly wasn't the same shame we would feel today. Instead of a wide, open smile, fashion dictated a small mouth and thin, rosy lips, preferably kept closed. A discreet smile, almost a sketch, was considered more modest and feminine. Full lips and a large mouth were seen as too sensual, vulgar, and inappropriate for a respectable lady. To enhance the color of their lips, women might bite them or apply mixtures based on plants or even dyed animal fat. But the goal was a subtle blush, not a vibrant color. Imagine the sensation, the metallic, sweet taste of decay in your own mouth, the constant bad breath which everyone tried to disguise with aromatic herbs like cloves or mint, but which never truly went away. The throbbing pain of an infected tooth, for which there was no remedy other than brutal extraction by a barber surgeon, without anesthesia. Smiling was not just a matter of aesthetics, but a negotiation with pain and discomfort. Perhaps that's why portraits from the era rarely show anyone smiling. It wasn't just an artistic convention. For many, smiling would reveal a mouthful of pain and decay, even if that decay was a symbol of their success. So, as you relax, think of your own smile. Think of the ease with which you can care for your teeth, the absence of pain. In the Middle Ages, even the act of smiling was complicated, a mix of status, pain, and forced modesty. A bitter smile indeed. With your pale face, high forehead, and discreetly decayed smile, attention turns to your crowning glory, your hair, and in the hair color palette of the Middle Ages, one shade reigned supreme, especially in poetic and artistic ideals: blonde. Golden or reddish blonde hair, the famous Venetian blonde, was celebrated as the epitome of angelic beauty and femininity. It was the hair of angels, of the Virgin Mary in countless paintings, of the heroines of chivalric tales. To have naturally blonde hair was a blessing, a sign of divine favor. But as genetics are indifferent to fashion, most women were not born with this coveted color, and just like today, they were willing to do almost anything to get it. The problem was that there were no beauty salons with trained professionals or chemically balanced products. The quest for the perfect blonde was a journey of domestic alchemy, a series of dangerous experiments conducted in the privacy of their own chambers. Recipes for bleaching hair were passed down by word of mouth or found in beauty manuscripts, and their ingredients ranged from harmless to downright toxic. One of the most common and relatively safe mixtures involved using acidic ingredients. Women would apply a paste made of lemon juice, onion, and alum, an astringent mineral, to their hair, and then sit in the sun for hours on end, hoping the combination of acid and UV rays would work its lightning magic. To protect their faces from the sun and maintain the coveted pallor, they wore a wide-brimmed crownless hat called a solana, which exposed only the hair to the sun while shading the skin. Imagine the boredom, the neck stiffness, the smell of onions slowly cooking on your head. However, when these milder methods failed to produce the desired golden hue, women turned to much more potent and dangerous ingredients. One popular recipe involved mixing black sulfur, honey, and alum, and applying the paste to the hair. Sulfur is an effective bleaching agent, but it is also corrosive. The mixture could cause chemical burns on the scalp, severe irritation, and, in extreme cases, permanent hair loss. Another common ingredient was lye, a strong alkaline solution, usually made from wood ash. Lye could indeed lighten hair, but it also destroyed it, leaving it brittle, dry, and lifeless, the opposite of the silky, flowing hair they so desired. The most frightening of all was the use of lead. Lead combs were used in the belief that repeated contact with the metal would darken gray hair, but other lead compounds were also mixed into powders and pastes to alter hair color. Lead poisoning, slow and cumulative, was an inevitable consequence, leading to headaches, neurological problems, infertility, and eventually death. They were literally dying for beauty, slowly poisoning themselves in pursuit of a hair color that society told them was the most desirable. The irony was that while noble women risked these toxic potions to lighten their hair, in some parts of Europe, like Venice, prostitutes were required by law to dye their hair blonde to distinguish themselves from respectable women. Beauty was a confusing and contradictory battlefield, where the same ideal could signify angelic purity for one and a mark of shame for another. Now that your face and hair conform to the painful standards of the era, let's examine the rest of your body. Set aside any modern notion of a toned body, a flat stomach, or a prominent bust. The ideal silhouette of the late Middle Ages is one of the most curious and, for us, counterintuitive in fashion history. The coveted look was that of a pregnant virgin. Yes, you heard that right. Fashion dictated a posture and a shape that deliberately created the illusion of a rounded, protruding belly, combined with a small, flat chest and narrow, sloping shoulders. It was an S-shaped figure, with the back arched and the abdomen pushed forward. This strange silhouette was achieved through a combination of posture and clothing. Women were taught to stand in a specific way, projecting their hips backward and their stomach forward, creating an exaggerated curve in the lower back. The clothing itself was designed to accentuate this shape. The dresses, known as coats or kirtles, were incredibly tight on the upper body, compressing the breasts to make them appear smaller and less defined. Christian modesty played a role here. A large bust was considered lascivious and sinful, so fashion sought to flatten and minimize it. From the waist down, however, the dress opened into a profusion of fabric, with long, heavy skirts that pooled on the floor. To further enhance the prominence of the belly, women often wore a small padding, a kind of cushion called a ventre, tied under the dress just below the waistline. The obvious question is, why? Why emulate pregnancy? Historians have several theories. One is linked to the importance of fertility and lineage in aristocratic society. The primary duty of a noblewoman was to produce heirs, preferably male, to continue the family name and fortune. The pregnant virgin silhouette was a constant visual celebration of fertility and reproductive potential. It was as if the body were perpetually announcing its ability to fulfill its most vital purpose. Furthermore, the figure also echoed representations of the Virgin Mary and other saints in the art of the time, who were often depicted with a similar figure, symbolizing spiritual purity and sacred motherhood. The combination of virgin, small breasts, modesty, and pregnant, protruding belly fertility, created a complex ideal of pious and functional femininity. For us, living in a culture obsessed with flat stomachs and defined abs, this ideal seems bizarre. Imagine the physical effort of constantly maintaining this arched posture. The back pain must have been chronic. Imagine the feeling of wearing clothes that compress your chest while adding volume to your belly. It was a form of beauty that not only dictated appearance, but also controlled the body's movement and posture. You couldn't just relax and stand comfortably. You had to wear your body in the correct way, actively shaping it into the fashionable silhouette. As you lie comfortably, allowing your spine to relax and your belly to rise and fall with your breath, appreciate the freedom of not having to contort yourself into an S shape to be considered beautiful. Medieval beauty was not in comfort or naturalness, but in an artificial and symbolic construction that transformed the female body into a constant advertisement of its social and religious role. You've already achieved pallor by avoiding the sun, but what if nature doesn't cooperate? What if, despite your best efforts to hide within stone walls, your skin insists on having a healthy tone, or worse, is marked by freckles, acne scars, or the damage from diseases like smallpox? Do not despair. The well-to-do medieval woman had an arsenal of cosmetics at her disposal. However, forget today's lightweight foundations and breathable concealers. Your medieval makeup box is, in fact, a box of poisons. The most effective and coveted ingredients for achieving white, smooth, and flawless skin were lead and arsenic. The most popular cosmetic for whitening the face was Venetian ceruse, also known as Spiritus Saturni. It was a thick white paste made of lead carbonate mixed with vinegar and water. Women would apply this paste in thick layers on their face, neck, and chest, creating a white, opaque mask that hid any imperfections underneath. The result was an artificially smooth skin of a ghostly whiteness, the height of fashion. The problem, of course, was the lead. Lead is a highly toxic heavy metal that is slowly absorbed by the body through the skin. Continuous use of ceruse led to chronic lead poisoning, a slow and insidious process. The symptoms began subtly: headaches, loss of appetite, a persistent metallic taste in the mouth. Over time, they evolved into excruciating abdominal pain, neurological problems, paralysis, and brain damage. Lead also attacked the tooth enamel, causing them to rot and fall out and cause terrible damage to the very skin it was intended to beautify. Prolonged use of ceruse corroded the skin, creating scars, discoloration, and wrinkles. The tragic irony was that to hide this damage, women had to apply increasingly thick layers of the poison, trapping themselves in a vicious cycle of destruction and concealment. They were literally sacrificing their health and their long-term natural beauty for the momentary appearance of perfection. Many women, including famous figures like the Countess of Coventry centuries later, demonstrably died from the effects of their lead-based cosmetic. If lead wasn't enough, there was also arsenic. Arsenic was used both topically, in powders and creams, and ingested in small quantities. It was believed that eating small doses of arsenic would give the skin a pearly sheen and the eyes a special sparkle. And indeed, arsenic can create a feverish glow appearance by inducing mild anemia and destroying red blood cells. However, arsenic is a potent poison. The line between a cosmetic dose and a lethal dose was dangerously thin. Arsenic poisoning causes vomiting, pain, damage to internal organs, and eventually, an agonizing death. Even in small doses, it accumulates in the body, causing long-term damage. Imagine the daily ritual. You sit before your polished metal mirror and, with your fingers or a cloth, spread this cold, heavy lead paste over your skin. The chemical smell of vinegar and metal fills the air. The mask dries, tightening the skin, making facial expressions difficult. You feel elegant, refined, beautiful, but unbeknownst to you, the poison is seeping into your bloodstream, silently dismantling your body from within. It's a terrifying thought. The pursuit of beauty was a dangerous gamble, a game of Russian roulette with cosmetic pots. As you lie down in safety, feel the lightness of your own skin, free from these deadly toxins. Beauty, for you, doesn't have to be a death sentence. Your skin is now covered in a layer of white, opaque poison. But the quest for a fragile and delicate appearance doesn't end there. Remember, the ideal is not just to look pale, but also sickly, as if you were a delicate flower with barely any blood in your veins. A rosy, robust complexion is the mark of the peasant, one who has warm, strong blood for manual labor. The nobility, on the other hand, aspired to an ethereal languor, and to achieve this bloodless look, they turned to one of the most common and enduring medical practices in history: bloodletting. Bloodletting, or phlebotomy, was a pillar of medieval medicine, based on the ancient theory of the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Perfect health was believed to depend on the balance of these four fluids. Any illness, from a cold to the plague, was attributed to an excess of one or more humors. Blood was considered the dominant humor, and therefore, the most common cause of imbalance. The logical solution, in the medieval mind, was to remove the excess blood to restore the body's harmony. Barber surgeons and even monks in monasteries performed the procedure regularly to treat almost every imaginable ailment. But bloodletting was not only used as a remedy, it was also a tool of beauty. To induce the desired pallor and reinforce the image of delicacy, noble women voluntarily submitted to bloodletting. They believed that draining a little blood from the body would result in a clearer, more translucent skin, diminishing any natural blush on the cheeks. It was an extreme way to get the sick chic look. The procedure itself was anything but delicate. The barber surgeon would use a sharp lancet to make an incision in a vein, usually on the inside of the elbow. The blood was then collected in a bowl, the amount determined by the physician based on the person's constitution, age, and condition. The blood loss induced real pallor, dizziness, and weakness, symptoms that, ironically, were interpreted as signs that the body was purifying itself and achieving a state of refinement. If the idea of being cut with a knife wasn't appealing, there was an equally charming alternative: leeches. These small aquatic annelids were applied directly to the skin. With their 3 jaws and hundreds of tiny teeth, the leech latches on, injects a local anesthetic and an anticoagulant, and begins to suck blood. A single leech can consume several times its body weight in blood. After its meal, it simply detaches and falls off. Women would apply leeches to their face and neck to achieve a localized lightening effect. Imagine the sensation of a cold, slimy creature wriggling on your cheek, the slight sting followed by the feeling of suction. It was a beauty treatment that seemed straight out of a nightmare. The danger, of course, was immense. Bloodletting, whether by lancet or leech, weakened the body, making the person more susceptible to real infections. The instruments were rarely sterilized, so the risk of contracting a serious bacterial infection in the incision was very high. Excessive blood loss could lead to chronic anemia or even death. In a world with no knowledge of germs or the importance of hygiene, these women were risking their lives, not to cure a disease, but to conform to a beauty standard that glorified weakness. As you rest, feel your blood pulsing warm and strong beneath your skin, a sign of life and health. Feel the relief of living in an era where vitality is valued, not something to be drained into a bowl in the name of fashion. You now embody the medieval ideal of beauty. Your skin is a ghostly white thanks to a layer of lead. Your forehead is vast and plucked. Your smile hides sugar-stained teeth. Your hair has been dyed with sulfur. Your silhouette mimics a pregnant virgin, and your blood has been partially drained by leeches to ensure an ethereal fragility. You look like a work of art, but there's a small problem. You smell bad. In fact, everyone around you smells bad. Welcome to one of the most pervasive and least romantic aspects of medieval life, the odor. Personal hygiene, as we understand it, simply did not exist. A full bath, with immersion in hot water, was a rare event and often viewed with suspicion. Public bathhouses, which were popular in the early Middle Ages, were gradually closed in many areas, partly because of their association with prostitution and debauchery, and partly out of fear. During outbreaks of diseases like the Black Death, it was believed that hot water opened the pores of the skin, allowing the bad air or miasmas carrying the disease to enter the body. Water was seen as a vector of contagion, not a cleaning agent. As a result, people, including the nobility, avoided bathing. A noble might take a full bath a few times a year, perhaps on special occasions like Christmas or Easter. Daily cleaning was a dry, or at best, damp process. It involved rubbing the face and hands with a clean linen cloth, sometimes moistened with cold water or rose water. It was believed that linen, worn as underwear, shirts and chemises, had absorbent properties that cleaned the body by soaking up sweat and dirt. The theory was that by changing your linen regularly, you were, in fact, cleaning yourself. But this did little to combat the body odor that accumulated day after day, ingrained in the heavy layers of wool and velvet of the outer garments, which were rarely washed. Add to this the smell of fireplace smoke, rancid food, decaying teeth, and the general odor of a city without basic sanitation, and you have an overwhelming olfactory symphony. To combat this cacophony of smells, the wealthy turned to perfume. But medieval perfume was not the subtle fragrance we apply to clean skin. It was an olfactory weapon, a desperate attempt to mask, rather than eliminate, unpleasant odors. The perfumes were strong, heavy, and made from exotic and expensive substances. Musk, from a gland of the musk deer, ambergris, an intestinal secretion of the sperm whale, and civet, from a gland of the civet cat, were popular bases. They were animalic, potent, and long-lasting aromas that we would consider overwhelming, even unpleasant today. These substances were mixed with spices like clove, cinnamon, and nutmeg, and resins like frankincense and myrrh. Noble men and women carried pomanders, which were small perforated metal balls filled with these aromatic mixtures. They would hold them close to their nose when walking through foul-smelling streets or when conversing with particularly odorous people. They also rubbed the perfumed pastes on their clothes and skin, or wore sachets of dried herbs and flowers sewn into their garments. The goal was not to smell clean, but to smell of wealth. Perfume was a luxury, a sign that you could afford to import exotic ingredients from around the world to disguise the fact that you, like everyone else, did not bathe. Imagine the air in a castle's feast hall, a suffocating mix of sweat, smoke, food, bad breath, and dozens of heavy, competing animalic perfumes. It was a battle of odors, a chemical war waged in the name of social etiquette. Amidst this landscape of pale skins and plucked foreheads, the hair that remained on a woman's head, the hair that hadn't been plucked at the hairline or destroyed by bleaching potions, carried immense symbolic weight. Much more than a simple attribute of beauty, a woman's hair in the Middle Ages was a powerful symbol of her identity, her status, and above all, her virtue. The way she wore her hair communicated to the entire world, whether she was a single maiden, a respectable wife, or a woman of ill repute. Hair management was therefore a matter of personal and family honor. For a young unmarried woman, it was socially acceptable and even desirable to wear her hair long and loose, falling in waves down her back. This was a sign of her virginity and availability for marriage. Loose hair was her glory, celebrated in songs and poems as one of her most attractive features. Think of the depictions of damsels in distress or young heroines in tapestries and illuminated manuscripts. They almost always have long braids or flowing hair. It was a symbol of youth, purity, and potential. However, this capillary freedom was temporary and ended abruptly on her wedding day. Once married, a respectable woman was required to cover her hair in public. Leaving her hair uncovered was considered an act of immodesty, a sexual provocation unbefitting a committed woman. Hair was seen as one of the most seductive parts of the female body, and displaying it openly was like advertising an availability she should no longer have. Covering her hair was a clear sign of her new married status, a visual declaration that she belonged to her husband and was under his protection and authority. The only person who should have the privilege of seeing her uncovered hair was her husband, in the privacy of their chambers. The variety of hair coverings was vast and indicated the woman's wealth and status. They could be simple linen veils, intricate hairnets made of silk and gold thread known as cauls, or elaborate structured headdresses like the hennin, that conical fairy tale hat, or the escoffion, a headdress shaped like horns or a heart. These accessories not only hid the hair but also displayed the family's wealth through expensive fabrics, jewels, and embroidery. The complexity of a woman's hair covering was as clear an indicator of her social position as her husband's coat of arms. Violating these hair norms had serious social consequences. A married woman who appeared in public with her hair uncovered would be seen as shameless, adulterous, or even a prostitute. In many cities, prostitutes were actually forced by law to wear their hair uncovered or in a specific style, so they could be easily identified and distinguished from honest women. On the other hand, cutting a woman's hair by force was an act of deep humiliation. It was a form of public punishment for adulteresses or women accused of witchcraft, stripping them of their femininity and their place in society. Hair was so intrinsically linked to honor that losing it, voluntarily or involuntarily, was to lose a fundamental part of one's identity. So as you lie down, perhaps running your fingers through your own hair, cut and styled as you see fit, think of the weight that each strand carried for your medieval ancestors. It was not just a matter of fashion, but of morality, status, and social survival. Your eyes, now framed by a vast, eyebrowless forehead, need a final touch to reach the height of medieval seduction. In your quest for beauty, you've learned that pallor denotes nobility, and fragility is chic. Now you will learn that pupil dilation is a sign of attraction. In a world lit by candles and fireplaces, where faces were often seen in half-light, large, dark eyes that seemed to drink in the ambient light were considered incredibly captivating. A look with dilated pupils was interpreted as a sign of interest, of excitement, of a receptive and passionate soul. It was the look of the enamored maiden, and noble women discovered a dangerous way to fake this appearance. The chosen tool for this task was a plant with a deceptively beautiful name, belladonna. The name itself comes from Italian, bella donna, which literally means beautiful woman. The plant earned this name precisely because of its cosmetic use. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, contains atropine and scopolamine, alkaloids that have a potent effect on the parasympathetic nervous system. One of these effects is mydriasis, or the dilation of the pupil. Women would prepare an extract from the plant, usually in the form of drops, and apply it directly to their eyes. The effect was almost immediate and dramatically effective. The pupils would expand, swallowing the iris and creating a dark, deep, and mysterious gaze that was considered the pinnacle of beauty and attraction. With their eyes thus transformed, a woman could cast a glance across a banquet hall and convey a message of silent fascination. It was a form of nonverbal communication, a tool in the complex game of courtly love and flirtation. The gaze was everything, and belladonna ensured that your gaze was unforgettable. However, beauty, as always in this period, came with a terrible price. Belladonna is not called deadly nightshade for nothing. The entire plant, especially its dark, shiny berries, is extremely poisonous. The same alkaloids that dilate the pupils are potent neurotoxins. Regular application of belladonna extract to the eyes led to the absorption of these toxins into the bloodstream. The short-term side effects were, at the very least, uncomfortable. The extreme dilation of the pupils causes severe sensitivity to light, photophobia, making vision in bright environments almost impossible and painful. Vision also became blurred, as the dilated pupils could not focus properly. Women who used belladonna were, in practice, visually impaired, stumbling through a beautiful but blurry world. The long-term effects were much worse. Chronic use could lead to increased intraocular pressure, contributing to glaucoma and permanent blindness. And there was always the risk of systemic poisoning. A dose slightly stronger than intended could cause dry mouth, tachycardia, difficulty urinating, mental confusion, vivid hallucinations, and delirium. An even larger dose led to convulsions, coma, and death from respiratory arrest. Every drop applied to the eyes was a gamble. The woman was toying with a substance that could rob her of her sight, her sanity, and her life, all in the name of having eyes that looked more passionate. Imagine the scene: a noble lady, with blurred vision and a racing heart, trying to gracefully navigate a sunny garden, blinking against the light that her eyes could no longer filter, all to maintain the appearance of a seductive and dreamy beauty. It is an image of dangerous dedication to an aesthetic ideal. As you close your eyes to sleep, feel the comfort of natural darkness, the ability of your own eyes to adjust, to focus, to see the world clearly. It is a simple and wonderful function that no medieval woman would dare risk for a fashionable gaze. You have already shaped your skin, your hair, your eyes, and your silhouette according to medieval ideals. Now let's talk about what's underneath it all, or rather the lack of it. In an era of endemic hunger and food scarcity for the majority of the population, extreme thinness among elite women became a complex aesthetic and spiritual ideal. While peasants struggled to get enough calories to survive, and a robust, well-fed body was a sign of health and capacity for work, in aristocratic and religious circles, the voluntary deprivation of food was seen in a very different light. Thinness was not just a matter of appearance but of piety. This phenomenon is known today by some historians as holy anorexia, or anorexia mirabilis, miraculous fasting. It refers to the practice of women, usually nuns, beguines, women who lived in religious communities without taking formal vows, or lay saints, who deprived themselves of food as a form of religious devotion. In a society deeply imbued with Christian faith, the body was often seen as a vessel of sin, a source of carnal temptations that needed to be subjugated and controlled so that the spirit could flourish. Fasting was an established religious practice, a way to purify the soul, imitate the sufferings of Christ, and draw closer to God. For some women, however, this fasting went far beyond the practices prescribed by the church. They took self-denial to extremes, eating only enough to stay alive, and sometimes not even that. The ability to survive on very little or no food was seen by their communities as a sign of holiness, a miracle. It was believed that these women were sustained not by earthly bread, but by the Eucharist, by the spiritual food of God. Figures like Saint Catherine of Siena in the 14th century became famous for their extreme fasts. She claimed she could not eat, that the smell of food made her vomit, and that her only nourishment was the sacred host. Her skeletal thinness was not seen as a sign of illness, but as visible proof of her devotion and her sacred status. This idealization of ascetic thinness in religious circles inevitably influenced secular beauty standards. The figure of the emaciated, fragile, and ethereal saint merged with the aristocratic ideal of delicacy. A thin woman appeared purer, more spiritual, and less earthly, or animalistic. Thinness reinforced the idea that she was above basic bodily needs, a creature of refinement and self-control. Although noble ladies did not necessarily fast with the same fervent intensity as the saints, diet was certainly a tool to achieve the slender silhouette and fragile appearance that fashion dictated. Imagine the pressure. You are already wearing clothes that compress your chest and force a painful posture. You are applying poisons to your skin and eyes. And now, you also need to severely restrict your food intake to achieve this coveted thinness. Food, especially at a noble banquet, was a display of wealth and power, but partaking in it excessively went against the ideal of feminine beauty. It was a delicate balance, to be surrounded by abundance but to practice restraint. Hunger was a constant companion, not out of necessity, as for the poor, but by choice, in the name of fashion and piety. The rumbling stomach, the dizziness, the weakness, all were sacrifices on the altar of beauty. As you lie down, perhaps after a satisfying dinner, feel the peace of nourishing your body without guilt, of understanding that strength, not hunger, is a sign of well-being. For the medieval woman, this simple truth was lost in a complex tangle of faith, status, and aesthetics. Having sculpted your body through diet, posture, and clothing, and having refined every feature of your face, there remains one crucial detail that communicates your social status as effectively as the pallor of your skin: your hands. In an era where the vast majority of the population lived by manual labor, hands were a map of a person's life. The hands of a peasant or an artisan were inevitably rough, calloused with broken nails and stained with dirt, grease, or dye. They were strong, capable hands, marked by the daily toil necessary for survival. For the aristocracy, therefore, the ideal was the exact opposite. The hands of a noble lady were to be the personification of idleness. The ideal of beauty for female hands was that they be pale, soft, slender, and delicate, with long tapering fingers and clean, well-groomed nails. Such hands were a silent but eloquent testament that their owner had never plowed a field, scrubbed a floor, cooked over an open fire, or performed any form of heavy labor. They were hands that existed for graceful gestures, for holding a prayer book, for doing fine embroidery, or for playing a musical instrument like the lute. They were, in essence, ornamental hands, a symbol of pure leisure, and consequently, of immense wealth and privilege. To achieve and maintain this appearance, noble women took great care. They protected their hands from the sun with the same fervor with which they protected their faces, to keep the skin pale and free of freckles. Gloves made of soft leather, silk, or linen were an essential accessory, not just for warmth, but as a barrier against the elements and work. At night, women applied emollients to keep the skin soft. These lotions were made from ingredients like beeswax, animal fat, usually from sheep, resulting in lanolin, and vegetable oils, such as almond oil, often scented with flowers or herbs to disguise the rancid smell of the fat. They might even sleep with gloves on to ensure the mixture was fully absorbed and to protect their expensive sheets. The shape of the hands was also important. Long, thin fingers were considered the epitome of elegance. Although bone structure is largely genetic, the appearance of tapering fingers was enhanced by the absence of muscles developed through labor and by maintaining oval, moderately long nails. The nails were meticulously cleaned and sometimes polished with a cloth to give a subtle sheen. The use of colored nail polishes as we know them did not exist, but a slight rosy blush could be achieved by rubbing the nails with certain plants or powders, although a natural, clean look was generally preferred. This obsession with perfect idle hands was yet another way the female body was transformed into a social billboard. Every gesture, every movement of the hand was a performance of status. Imagine a lady at court extending her hand for a knight to kiss. The sight of her pale, soft hand, emerging from a silk sleeve, was an instant reaffirmation of her high position. It contrasted brutally with the hands of her servants, which were strong and marked by the labor that made their lady's leisure possible. The beauty of the lady's hands was, in a way, built upon the hard work of other people's hands. As you relax, perhaps with your hands resting by your side or on your chest, think of their capability. Think of all they do for you in a single day. Typing, cooking, driving, creating, caring. Your hands are tools of agency and power in the world. For the noble medieval woman, they were the opposite, a symbol of her dependence and her restricted ornamental life. The beauty of her hands lay precisely in what they did not do. Now that every visible part of your body has been shaped, dyed, and refined to fit medieval ideals, let's return to your silhouette. We've already established the strange fashion of the pregnant virgin, with its protruding belly and flattened chest. But how exactly was this shape imposed on the body, especially in the upper part? The answer lies in the early days of a garment that would haunt women for centuries: the corset. Although the Victorian corsets with whalebone stays and tight lacing are the most famous image, their roots can be found in the structured undergarments of the late Middle Ages. For much of the medieval period, the shape of the body was primarily dictated by the cut of the outer dress, the kirtle or cote-hardie. These garments were ingeniously cut and fitted to the torso through lacing at the sides or back, or with a long row of buttons down the front. The fabric itself, often thick wool, provided a certain degree of shaping, smoothing the figure and offering support. However, as fashion moved towards an increasingly rigid and defined silhouette, especially in the late 14th and 15th centuries, the need for a more robust substructure became apparent. Thus emerged a garment worn under the dress, designed specifically to shape the torso. It was not yet the corset with eyelets and laces that we know, but a stiffened bodice. This garment, sometimes called a pair of bodies, was constructed with layers of heavy linen fabric, glued together to create a rigid structure. To give it even more firmness, stiffening materials were inserted between the layers of fabric. These were not the steel or whalebone stays of the future, but more primitive materials like dried reeds, shaved animal horn, thin wood, or even baleen, the bristles from a whale's mouth, which are flexible and strong in its earliest forms. The main purpose of this primitive bodice was not necessarily to drastically reduce the waist, as in later centuries, but to create a smooth, conical, and rigid torso. It flattened the bust, pushing the breasts up and in, which helped to achieve the ideal of a small, high chest. It also created a smooth base upon which the expensive dress could sit without wrinkles or bumps, and it forced the body to maintain the erect, arched posture of the fashion. It was, in essence, a fashion armor, which restricted movement and breathing in the name of the perfect silhouette. Imagine the sensation of wearing one of these pieces: the stiff, glued fabric rubbing against your skin, the constant pressure on your chest and ribs, making a deep breath difficult. You wouldn't be able to bend easily at the waist. You would have to move more rigidly, almost like a doll. The bodice dictated not only your appearance, but also your way of moving, sitting, and interacting with the world. It was a physical discipline imposed by fashion. The relief at the end of the day when the laces were undone and the rigid bodice was removed must have been immense, a literal and figurative breath of fresh air. This constant compression had health consequences. The shallow breathing could lead to respiratory problems, and the pressure on the internal organs was certainly not beneficial. Fainting spells attributed to feminine delicacy were often a direct consequence of the combination of tight bodices, inadequate nutrition, and stuffy rooms. Beauty, once again, demanded suffering and placed the female body in a self-imposed prison of fabric and stiffeners. As you lie in your bed, feeling the freedom of your chest to expand fully with each breath, think of this fashion cage. Think of the price of that smooth, conical silhouette. The price was breath itself. So far, our journey through medieval beauty has focused almost exclusively on the impossible standards imposed on women. But what about the men? Were they exempt from these aesthetic pressures, free to exist in a state of happy, disheveled naturalness? Not at all. Although the ideals of masculine beauty were different and perhaps less overtly dangerous than the use of lead and belladonna, they were equally prescribed and linked to status, power, and virtue. A nobleman in the Middle Ages also had to cultivate a specific appearance to reflect his position in society. The ideal of medieval male beauty was, in many ways, a balance between the strength of the warrior and the refinement of the courtier. The appearance should convey virility, health, and a noble lineage. One of the main focuses was the hair and beard. Unlike women who plucked their hair to heighten their foreheads, men cultivated their hair, which was often worn at shoulder length or slightly shorter, and carefully styled into waves or curls. Well-groomed, shiny, and thick hair was a sign of vitality and youth. Like women, noblemen might also use lotions and oils to keep their hair healthy and fragrant. The beard and mustache went through fashion cycles. In certain periods, a clean-shaven face in the Roman style was preferred, suggesting a youthful, almost angelic appearance, especially among clerics and the very young. In other eras, a short, well-trimmed beard was the height of masculinity and wisdom. The beard had to be meticulously cared for, trimmed into a neat shape, and not left to grow wild, which would be a sign of rusticity or mourning. The barber, who was also the surgeon, was a central figure in a nobleman's life, responsible not only for a close shave, but also for shaping the beard and hair according to the latest fashion. The ideal male body was strong and well-proportioned, but not overly muscular in a way that suggested manual labor. The ideal was the body of a knight: broad shoulders, a strong chest, a slim waist, and crucially, long, well-turned legs. The legs were a particularly important part of male beauty, and the fashion of the time was designed to show them off. Men wore short tunics or doublets that ended at the hips combined with chausses, which were essentially tight-fitting hose, often in bright colors, and made of wool or silk. Each leg was covered by a separate piece, tied to a belt at the waist. This fashion accentuated the shape of the legs, and muscular, well-formed legs were highly admired, as they indicated strength and skill in riding and combat. Pallor, so coveted by women, was not a male ideal. A man should have a healthy complexion, though not the deep tan of a field worker. A slight flush was acceptable, indicating good health and vigorous blood. Physical strength was essential, but it had to be a refined strength. A nobleman's hands, for example, should be strong and capable of wielding a sword, but also clean and well cared for, capable of courtly gestures. Men's clothing was as important as women's in constructing the ideal image. Rich fabrics like velvet, brocade, and silk, dyed in vibrant and expensive colors like scarlet and blue, were used to display wealth. The silhouette was often padded in the shoulders and chest to create a more imposing appearance, the so-called peascod belly. And like women, men also used strong perfumes to mask body odors and display their access to luxury goods. Male beauty, therefore, was a carefully constructed performance of power. It was a visual statement that said, "I am strong enough to fight, rich enough to dress in luxury, and refined enough to belong at court." It was not the beauty of fragility, but the beauty of dominance and privilege. So far, we have explored the ideals of physical beauty, the skin, the hair, the silhouette, and how they were shaped by status, wealth, and even disease. But there is an omnipresent force in the Middle Ages that loomed over every facet of life, including the pursuit of beauty, the church. Christian doctrine had a deeply ambivalent and often hostile relationship with the body and with physical beauty. For the medieval woman or man, Navigating beauty standards was also navigating a theological minefield, where vanity was a deadly sin, and the body itself was a source of temptation. At the heart of medieval Christian thought was the idea that true beauty resided in the soul, not in the flesh. The body was seen as an earthly vessel, corruptible and sinful, a distraction from what truly mattered: eternal salvation. Physical beauty, particularly female beauty, was often portrayed by theologians and preachers as a dangerous trap, a tool of the devil to tempt men and lead them to the sin of lust. Tertullian, an early church father, went so far as to call women the devil's gateway. This misogynistic view persisted for centuries, creating an environment where a woman's beauty was simultaneously admired in a secular context, in poems and songs of courtly love, and condemned in a religious one. The church promoted modesty as the supreme female virtue. This translated into clear guidelines on appearance. Women were instructed to dress simply, to avoid garish colors, ostentatious jewelry, and above all, not to engage in artifices to alter their appearance. The use of cosmetics, such as lead ceruse or hair-dyeing extracts, was vehemently condemned from the pulpit. Preachers argued that wearing makeup was an attempt to improve upon God's creation, which was an act of arrogance and deception. It was like telling God that the face he gave you was not good enough. Painting one's face was, in essence, lying about one's true appearance, a moral fraud. This condemnation extended to almost all the beauty practices we have discussed. Plucking hair to heighten the forehead, wearing seductive perfumes, displaying the body in tight clothing, all of this was seen as a sign of vanity and a gateway to worse sins. The ideal beauty, from the church's point of view, was the beauty of the Virgin Mary, modest, humble, natural, and devoid of artifice. She was beautiful because of her inner purity, not because of external adornments. This created an agonizing paradox for the noble medieval woman. On the one hand, secular society and court culture demanded that she be a walking work of art, that she use her appearance to reflect the power and wealth of her family. Her marriage, her status, and her influence depended on her ability to play the beauty game. On the other hand, the most powerful moral authority in her life, the Church, told her that this very pursuit of beauty was putting her immortal soul in peril. Every time she applied the poisonous ceruse or covered her hair with an expensive headdress, she was committing an act of vanity that could condemn her to hell. The life of a noblewoman was, therefore, a constant balancing act between the demands of the court and the commandments of God. She had to be beautiful enough to attract a good husband and maintain her position, but not so beautiful or artificial as to be accused of impiety or lasciviousness. It was a fine and impossible line to walk. Beauty was both a social necessity and a spiritual danger. As you relax, free from this dichotomy, think of the peace of being able to express yourself through your appearance without the fear of eternal damnation. For the medieval woman, every mirror reflected not just her image but also a moral judgment on her soul. So far, our sleepy journey has unfolded in the cold stone halls of castles and the opulent courts of the nobility. We have focused on the beauty ideals of a small, privileged elite, a world of poisonous pallor, plucked foreheads, and contorted silhouettes. But what about the overwhelming majority of the population? What about the peasant women, the servants, the wives of artisans who made up over 90% of medieval society? Did they also aspire to this fragile, sickly appearance? The answer is a resounding no. For the women of the countryside, beauty was not a matter of ornamental aesthetics but of functionality, strength, and survival. The life of a peasant woman was defined by relentless physical labor. From sunrise to sunset, she was in motion. She worked alongside her husband in the fields, sowing, weeding, and harvesting. She tended the livestock, milked the cows or goats, fed the chickens. She was responsible for the family's vegetable garden, which provided essential vegetables for their diet. She spun wool, wove fabric, sewed and mended the family's clothes. She carried water from the well or river, ground grain, prepared meals over an open fire, and cared for a brood of children. Her life was an endless succession of physically demanding tasks. In this context, the beauty ideals of the nobility were not just unattainable, they were absurd and counterproductive. Pallor? Impossible for someone who spent most of the day under the sun. A peasant woman's skin was inevitably tanned and weathered, marked by freckles and premature wrinkles from sun exposure. Delicate hands? A joke. Her hands were strong, calloused, and often dirty, essential tools for her work. A fragile, thin figure? A dangerous disadvantage. A peasant woman needed a strong, robust body, with muscles and endurance to withstand hard labor and repeated pregnancies. Thinness was not a sign of piety, but of hunger and disease, a real threat to her family's survival. Beauty in the peasant world was synonymous with health and capability. A beautiful woman was one who looked strong, healthy, and fertile. Rosy cheeks were not a sign of vulgarity, but of good blood and vitality. Wide hips and a sturdy body were not coarse, but indicated that she was strong enough for work and likely able to survive the dangers of childbirth. Her teeth, though not perfect, were often healthier than those of the nobility, thanks to a low-sugar diet based on whole-grain bread, vegetables, legumes, and dairy. A peasant woman's clothing also reflected her practical life. She wore simple, durable clothes made of coarse wool and linen in earthy, undyed tones. Her dresses were shorter, ending at the ankles so they wouldn't drag in the mud, and were designed to allow freedom of movement. She covered her hair with a simple linen coif or kerchief, not for vanity, but for practicality, to keep her hair out of the way, protected from the sun and clean of dirt and lice. There was a literal and visible class division inscribed on the bodies of medieval women. You could tell a woman's position in society just by looking at her. The noble lady was a pale, fragile, ornamental creature, her beauty a symbol of her idleness. The peasant woman was rosy, strong, and functional, her appearance a reflection of her life of work. They inhabited completely different aesthetic worlds, separated by a chasm of privilege. The noble lady used poison to look sick, while the peasant woman prayed to stay healthy. As you snuggle down, think of this division. Think of the beauty that is born from strength, resilience, and capability. It is a different kind of beauty, less celebrated in courtly poems, but perhaps far more real and fundamental to the survival of humanity. We've already touched briefly on the medieval smile and the strange twist that made rotten teeth a sign of status. Now let's delve a little deeper into this connection, focusing on the delicious and destructive culprit behind it all: sugar. Today we think of sugar as a ubiquitous and cheap ingredient, a staple of almost all processed foods. But in the Middle Ages, sugar was the equivalent of edible gold. It was an exotic, rare, and incredibly expensive luxury good that redefined not only the cuisine of the elite, but also their standards of beauty and oral health. Sugar, derived from sugarcane, was primarily grown in the Middle East and North Africa. It came to Europe through the Crusades and Venetian trade routes, and its price was astronomical. Only the richest of the rich, royalty, high nobility, and the wealthiest merchants could afford to use it. For the elite, sugar was not just a sweetener. It was a form of ostentation, a way to display their immense wealth and global connections. They used it in everything, not just in desserts, but also as a spice in meat and fish dishes, to create complex sweet and sour sauces. At banquets, elaborate sculptures made entirely of sugar, called subtleties, were presented between courses, dazzling guests with the host's sheer extravagance. Sugar consumption became a fashionable addiction among the aristocracy. Queen Elizabeth I, who reigned a bit after the medieval period but whose habits reflected this long-standing trend, was legendary for her love of sweets. She consumed so many sugary products that her teeth, according to contemporary accounts, turned black and rotted. A German ambassador noted that her teeth were black, a defect the English seemed subject to from their great use of sugar. Far from being a source of shame, this dental decay became an unintentional status symbol. If you had black, cavity-ridden teeth, it meant you had unlimited access to the most expensive consumer good of the era. It was irrefutable proof of your position at the top of the social pyramid. In contrast, peasants in the lower class, whose diet consisted of coarse bread, vegetables, and perhaps a little honey as a sweetener, had much healthier teeth. White, strong teeth, ironically, could be associated with poverty. This inversion of aesthetic values is hard for us to comprehend, as we spend fortunes on teeth whitening and orthodontics. But in a world where the display of wealth was paramount, the physical signs of that wealth, even if they were destructive, were valued. This plague of sweetness was not limited to staining teeth. Rampant tooth decay led to chronic toothaches, abscesses, and severe infections. In an era without antibiotics, a dental infection could easily spread to the jaw, blood, or brain, resulting in an agonizing death. The only cure for a rotten tooth was extraction, performed without anesthesia by a barber surgeon or an itinerant tooth drawer, using tools that more closely resembled instruments of torture. The fear of excruciating pain meant that many nobles preferred to endure chronic pain and bad breath, rather than face the extractor's pliers. Therefore, the smile of the medieval elite was a complex landscape of status and suffering. Their blackened teeth were a trophy of their wealth, but also a constant source of pain and discomfort. Perhaps that is why fashion dictated thin lips and a small closed mouth. It was an elegant way to hide the devastation wrought by luxury. As you relax, think of the simplicity of a painless smile. Think of the modern luxury that is not sugar, but the dental health we take for granted. A blessing that all the gold in the medieval world could not buy. Now that we've established that the mouth of the medieval elite was a minefield of sugar-induced cavities and chronic pain, a practical and rather intimate question arises. How did they deal with the inevitable bad breath? The foul odor of dental decay, combined with the general lack of hygiene and diets rich in meat and spices, must have created a truly challenging personal atmosphere. In a courtly culture that valued proximity, conversation, and flirtation, bad breath or foul breath was a significant social problem. And while they lacked the microbiological knowledge to understand the causes, they were certainly aware of the problem and tried a variety of desperate and largely ineffective methods to combat it. The first line of defense was mechanical cleaning, though it was rudimentary. The concept of a bristled toothbrush did not yet exist in the West. Instead, people, if they cleaned their teeth at all, used a piece of linen or wool cloth. They would wrap the fabric around their finger and rub it vigorously on their teeth and gums. Sometimes the cloth was dipped in water or rose water to give a feeling of freshness. For more abrasive action, they might dip the cloth in a tooth powder. These powders were made from ingredients like salt, ground chalk, pulverized charcoal, or more exotic and destructive substances like brick dust, coral, or eggshells. The idea was to scrape away plaque and food debris, but these harsh abrasives also wore down the tooth enamel, making them even more vulnerable to decay in the long run. When mechanical cleaning failed to solve the odor problem, which it invariably did, the next strategy was masking. Just as heavy perfumes were used to cover up body odor, a variety of aromatic substances were used to disguise bad breath. Chewing on fresh herbs or spices was the most common practice. Anise seeds, cloves, cardamom, cinnamon sticks, and mint or parsley leaves were kept on hand to be chewed before an important conversation. Cloves in particular were valued not only for their strong aroma, but also for their mild anesthetic properties, which could help soothe the pain of an inflamed tooth. For the wealthiest, there were perfumed pastilles or comfits, made of sugar, ironically, mixed with ground spices and fixatives like musk or ambergris. They were the precursors to our mints, but with much more complex and exotic flavors, designed both to freshen the breath and to display the wealth of the consumer. Additionally, mouthwashes, or mouthwaters, were popular. These were mixtures of wine or vinegar infused with herbs and spices like rosemary, sage, and thyme. A person would swish the liquid to try to neutralize odors. The alcohol and acidity of the vinegar might have had a temporary antibacterial effect, but they could also irritate the gums and further erode tooth enamel. Medical and beauty texts of the time are filled with recipes to combat foul breath. One recipe recommended burning the roots of rosemary and mixing the ashes with wine to rinse with. Another suggested a mixture of anise, fennel, and clove powder to be used as a dry powder in the mouth. However, all these solutions were, at best, temporary palliatives. They could not treat the root cause of the problem: bacterial infections, gingivitis, and decaying teeth. It was like spraying perfume on a gangrenous wound. The relief was momentary, and the underlying rot continued to worsen. Imagine the social anxiety. You are at a banquet, trying to have a witty conversation with a potential suitor or a powerful patron, but you are terribly conscious of the smell emanating from your own mouth. You discreetly chew on a clove, hoping it will work its magic while trying not to inhale too deeply when the other person speaks. It was a delicate dance of proximity and distance, a constant battle to keep up appearances, or rather, aromas, under control. The air between people in the Middle Ages was not just filled with the scent of perfume and sweat, but also with the persistent, sweetish cloud of oral decay. While the elite worried about the color and style of their hair, A much more democratic and irritating threat loomed over the heads of rich and poor alike: lice. In a world with poor hygiene, where bathing was rare and people lived in crowded and often unsanitary environments, head lice infestations, pediculus humanus capitis, were an omnipresent and troublesome part of daily life. No one was immune. Skeletons from all social classes, from peasants to nobles, have been found with fine-toothed lice combs buried alongside them, a testament to the universality of this persistent problem. The fight against lice was a daily battle, waged with a variety of tools and remedies. The most important tool in the anti-lice arsenal was the fine-toothed comb. These combs, often made of wood, bone, ivory, or metal, had 2 rows of teeth, one with wider spaced teeth for detangling the hair, and another with extremely fine, close-set teeth designed specifically to scrape adult lice and their nits, the eggs, from the hair shafts. The act of combing one's hair, especially with a fine-toothed comb, was as much a matter of style as it was of parasite control. It was a ritual that could be performed alone or as a social and intimate act, with a family member or servant carefully combing through another's hair, hunting for the tiny insects. However, combing was only a control measure, not an eradication one. To try to eliminate infestations for good, people turned to a variety of topical treatments, many of which were ineffective or dangerous. Folk remedies involved applying plant-based mixtures to the scalp. Strong-smelling herbs like rosemary, lavender, and wormwood were believed to repel lice. Other recipes were more aggressive, using ingredients like mercury, arsenic, or extracts from poisonous plants like stavesacre. The logic was that if the mixture was poisonous to humans, it would surely be poisonous to lice. Applying mercury to the scalp, as one can imagine, was a terrible idea, leading to poisoning through skin absorption, with severe neurological consequences. For men, a drastic but effective solution was to simply shave their heads. This was common among monks whose tonsure, the act of shaving the crown of the head, served a practical hygienic purpose in addition to its religious significance. For women, however, whose long hair was a symbol of femininity and status, shaving their heads was not a viable option, unless it was a form of punishment or extreme penance. This is where one of the most ingenious and enduring fashion solutions to the lice problem comes in: the wig. Although wigs became more prominent in later centuries, their origins as a hygienic tool are medieval. For those who could afford it, especially if they were suffering from hair loss due to illness, toxic treatments, or chronic lice infestations, the solution was to shave their natural hair and cover their head with a wig. The wig, made of human or animal hair, could be kept clean and free of lice much more easily than the hair on one's head. It could be removed, boiled, combed, and treated, while the shaved scalp underneath could be kept clean. The wig allowed a person to present a fashionable full head of hair without the constant bother and itching of a real infestation. Imagine the sensation, the incessant itching on your scalp, day and night. The social shame of being seen scratching your head or having a visible louse on your hair or clothing. The frustration of spending hours combing your hair, only to feel the itch return the next day. It was a constant and humbling reminder of the realities of life in a pre-modern world. The beauty of long flowing hair, so celebrated in poetry, came with the constant risk of harboring a colony of parasites. As you relax, appreciate the simple peace of a clean, itch-free scalp, a small but profound luxury that your medieval ancestors rarely knew. In our modern world, the quest for flawless skin is an obsession. A single blackhead or a small blemish can feel like a cosmetic catastrophe. Now, imagine living in an era when one of the most common and feared diseases left its victims, if they survived, permanently marked with deep, disfiguring scars. That disease was smallpox. Before its eradication in the 20th century, smallpox was a scourge of humanity for millennia, and its impact on medieval society, including its beauty standards, was profound and lasting. Smallpox was a highly contagious and often fatal viral disease. Those who were lucky enough to survive its high fevers, aches, and the painful pustules that covered the entire body rarely emerged unscathed. The disease left behind characteristic scars known as pockmarks, small depressions in the skin that created an uneven, pitted texture. In an era where smooth skin was a pillar of beauty, especially for the nobility, smallpox scars were an indelible mark that could ruin a woman's marriage prospects and social status. The prevalence of the disease was so high that having smooth, unmarked skin was, in itself, a sign of luck or great beauty. Poets and writers often praised their muse's skin for its smoothness, an attribute we might take for granted today, but which was remarkable at the time. On the other hand, pockmarks were such a common reality that society had to adapt to them. They became a factor in how beauty was perceived and constructed. For those marked by the disease, makeup became not just a tool of beautification, but of reconstruction. The same lead-based Venetian ceruse that was used to whiten the skin was also employed as a kind of primitive spackle. Women, and sometimes men, would apply thick layers of the white paste to fill in the scars and create an artificially smooth surface. The deeper the scars, the thicker the layer of makeup required, and the more toxic the dose of lead absorbed by the body. It was a desperate trade-off, risking lead poisoning to hide the marks of a disease that had nearly killed you. Another fashion that emerged partly in response to smallpox scars and other skin imperfections was the mouche, or fly in French. These were small patches of black velvet, taffeta, or silk, cut into various shapes: circles, stars, hearts, crescent moons, and glued onto the face. Although mouches reached the height of their popularity in the 17th and 18th centuries, their origins can be traced back to this period of necessity. A mouche could be strategically placed to cover a particularly prominent pockmark or other blemish. Over time, these beauty patches evolved from a tool of camouflage into a fashion accessory in their own right, with a complex code of flirtation associated with their placement. A mouche near the eye signified passion. At the corner of the mouth was an invitation for a kiss, and on the cheek indicated a gallant spirit. It was a way of turning a flaw into a point of interest, a fashion statement. The need to hide scars gave rise to a new language of seduction. Smallpox redefined beauty in a fundamental way. It made smooth skin a precious and rare commodity, and it forced society to find ways to live with the marks of disease. Beauty could no longer be just about natural perfection, because natural perfection was constantly threatened and destroyed by illness. Instead, beauty also became about artifice, concealment, and transformation. It was about the ability to construct a new face over the old one, using poisonous powders and velvet patches. As you lie down, perhaps feeling the smooth texture of your own skin, think of the resilience of your ancestors. They lived under the constant shadow of diseases that could steal not only their lives but also their faces. And yet, they found ways to redefine beauty and carry on, pockmarked, but with their heads held high. We have already established that a full bath was a rare and suspicious event in the Middle Ages, avoided for fear of disease and immoral associations. But this raises a question. How did people clean themselves even infrequently? The history of medieval bathing is more complex than a simple absence of cleanliness. It involves a shift in attitudes towards water, the rise and fall of public bathhouses, and a reliance on dry cleaning methods that would seem entirely inadequate to us today. In the early Middle Ages, the Roman tradition of public baths still lingered in many parts of Europe. Cities had stews or bathhouses, where citizens could go to bathe in large wooden tubs of hot water. These places were not just for hygiene. They were social hubs. People gathered to talk, eat, drink, and even conduct business. Men and women often bathed together, and the atmosphere was communal and relaxed. For the wealthy, bathing at home was also a possibility. A lord or lady might have a portable wooden tub, which would be brought into their chambers, lined with a linen cloth to prevent splinters and filled with buckets of water heated over the fire. Bathing was a luxury, an event that could last for hours and often involved the company of friends or a spouse. However, from the 14th century onwards, this bathing culture began to decline dramatically. Two main factors contributed to this. The first was the growing condemnation from the church. Clerics viewed mixed-gender bathhouses with great suspicion, denouncing them as hotbeds of sin, lust, and prostitution. They preached that nudity and communal bathing led to temptation and immorality. Pressure from the church led to the closure of many bathhouses and a general association of bathing with debauchery. The second and most devastating blow was the Black Death, which swept across Europe in the mid-14th century. In an era when the miasma theory, the belief that diseases were caused by bad air, dominated medical thought, a new and dangerous idea about water emerged. Physicians began to theorize that hot water opened the pores of the skin, making the body vulnerable to the entry of pestilential air. Bathing, once seen as healthy, was now considered an activity that invited death. The fear of the plague was so overwhelming that it trumped any desire for cleanliness. People began to avoid water with an almost religious fervor. As a result, personal hygiene transformed into a predominantly dry process. The main cleaning tool became linen undergarments. It was believed that linen fabric had the property of absorbing dirt, grease, and sweat from the body. The theory was that by changing your linen shirt or chemise every day, if you were wealthy enough to own several, you were effectively cleaning your body. The dirt passed from the body to the fabric, and by putting on a clean, fresh piece of linen, you were clean. The outer garments of wool and velvet, which were expensive and difficult to wash, were protected from the body's soil by this layer of linen. Cleaning the face and hands, the most visible parts of the body, was done more frequently, but still with minimal water. It involved the use of a basin and ewer. A person would hold their hands over the basin while a servant poured a stream of cold water over them. The face was cleaned in the same way, or simply rubbed with a damp cloth, often soaked in rosewater or other scented waters to give a sense of freshness and mask odors. The concept of scrubbing the entire body with soap and water was simply foreign and considered dangerous. Soap existed, but it was primarily used for washing clothes, not people. Cleanliness was superficial, localized, and focused more on keeping up appearances than on achieving genuine hygiene. Our journey through medieval beauty and fashion has taken us from head to toe, and it is precisely at the feet that we find one of the most extreme and impractical examples of how fashion could restrict the body and display status. Forget comfortable, functional shoes. In the late Middle Ages, especially in the 14th and 15th centuries, fashion for elite men was dominated by a style of footwear as bizarre as it was popular: pointed shoes known as craquois or poulaines. The name poulain comes from the French souliers à la poulaine, meaning shoes in the Polish style, as it is believed the fashion originated in the court of Krakow, Poland. These shoes were characterized by their absurdly long, tapering points. What began as a modestly elongated toe quickly escalated into a competition of excess. The points of the shoes became increasingly longer, extending far beyond the toes. For the nobility, the length of the shoe's point became a direct symbol of status. The longer the point, the higher your rank and the greater your wealth. These points could reach ridiculous lengths, sometimes extending 6, 12, or even 24 inches beyond the foot. They were so long and limp that they often had to be stuffed with materials like moss, wool, or horsehair to maintain their shape. In extreme cases, the points were so long that they had to be attached with a small gold or silver chain from the tip of the shoe to a band tied just below the knee, simply so the wearer wouldn't trip over them with every step. The impracticality of these shoes was precisely the point. Wearing craquois was the ultimate fashion statement that you did not need to do anything that resembled physical work. You couldn't run in them. You couldn't walk on uneven ground. You couldn't climb stairs with ease. You certainly couldn't fight or work in a field. Mobility was sacrificed on the altar of ostentation. Wearing these shoes was a form of performance art, a walking advertisement that your life was one of pure leisure, so privileged that you could afford to wear footwear that made you almost incapacitated for practical life. The church, as always, vehemently disapproved of this fashion. Preachers denounced craquois as a symbol of vanity and excess. They saw the long points as devil's claws, and the phallic associations were considered obscene and sinful. The fashion was seen as a manifestation of pride and a distraction from a pious life. Moral disapproval, however, did little to dampen the shoe's popularity among the young, fashionable courtiers who reveled in defying convention. Eventually, the fashion became so extreme that it attracted the attention of secular authorities. Sumptuary laws designed to regulate consumption and luxury, were enacted to control the length of the shoe points. These laws specified the maximum length allowed for each social class. For example, a prince could wear points of any length. A high-ranking nobleman could have points up to 24 inches. A knight could have 12-inch points, and a common citizen was limited to 6-inch points. A peasant, of course, was not allowed to wear them at all. The law, therefore, codified what fashion was already doing, using the length of footwear to reinforce and police the social hierarchy. Imagine trying to walk through a crowded hall with these extensions on your feet, trying not to trip over your own shoe or impale someone else's ankle. It was an awkward dance of privilege. As you lie down, feeling your feet relaxed and free, think of the freedom of movement you have. Think of the ability to walk, run, and move without your own shoes being an obstacle. For the medieval nobleman, even the act of walking was transformed into a performance of status, a deliberate and uncomfortable demonstration of his own glorious uselessness. Our long and sleepy exploration of brutal medieval beauty standards is coming to an end. We have walked a path of poisoned skin, plucked hair, contorted bodies, and masked odors. We have seen how beauty was intrinsically linked to status, religion, and survival. And now we arrive at the final destination of all medieval life, and indeed, all life, death. But even here, on the threshold between this world and the next, aesthetics and beauty ideals exerted their strange and powerful influence. The way a person looked as they died, and how they were remembered, was the culmination of a lifetime of social and spiritual performance. The idealization of a fragile and sickly appearance, which we saw as a pillar of feminine beauty in the nobility, found its ultimate expression on the deathbed. The beautiful death, or ars moriendi, the art of dying, was an important concept in the late Middle Ages. Manuals with this title circulated widely, instructing people on how to die well, that is, to die piously, repentantly, and at peace with God. But beyond spiritual preparation, there was also an aesthetic to death. The ideal death was not sudden or violent. It was a slow, gradual fading, which allowed time for final rituals and for the composition of a serene appearance. The same consumptive look tuberculosis that was emulated in life, the pallor, the ethereal thinness, the glittering eyes, was seen as the ideal way to depart. Such a death was considered beautiful and poetic. The person seemed to be shedding their earthly shell, becoming more spirit than flesh, preparing to ascend to heaven, and the struggle, the agony, and the physical manifestations of disease were, as much as possible, minimized or reinterpreted through a romantic and religious lens. A peaceful, serene death was believed to reflect a pure soul that was ready to meet its creator. This idealization extended to the representation of the dead. After death, the body was carefully prepared for the wake. The goal was to present an image of peace and repose, as if the person were merely sleeping. The face was cleaned, the hair combed, and the body dressed in a simple linen shroud or, for the very wealthy, in fine clothes. The hands were crossed over the chest in a gesture of prayer. It was the last performance of status and piety. The family wanted mourners to see an image of salvation, not suffering. This aesthetic of death is also immortalized in the tomb effigies found in churches and cathedrals across Europe. The tombs of nobles and knights were often adorned with life-size sculptures of the deceased carved from stone or alabaster. These effigies were not realistic portraits of the person's appearance at the time of death, but rather idealized representations. They were portrayed in their prime, young, healthy, and dressed in their finest clothes or armor. Women were sculpted with the soft features, high foreheads, and delicate hands that were valued in life. Men were shown as strong, pious knights. These sculptures were not just memorials. They were a prayer in stone, designed to present the best possible version of the deceased to God on Judgment Day. They were also a final statement of the family's status and lineage to earthly observers. The idealized beauty in the effigy served a dual purpose: to secure an honorable memory on earth, and, it was hoped, to influence divine judgment in heaven. Beauty, therefore, transcended life itself, becoming a tool to negotiate one's legacy and the afterlife. As you lie down, safe and comfortable, think about how our view of death has changed. We hide it, medicalize it, fight against it with all our might. In the Middle Ages, death was a constant, visible presence, and they integrated it into their culture and aesthetics in ways that seem strange to us. They found a morbid beauty in fragility, a serenity in departure, and an idealized permanence in stone. Beauty was not just for the living, it was a bridge to eternity. Throughout our sleepy exploration, we've seen how medieval fashion and beauty were powerful tools for displaying status. A high forehead, delicate hands, pointed shoes, expensive fabrics, all of these were visual cues that communicated a person's position in the rigid social hierarchy. But what if someone tried to cheat? What if a wealthy merchant started dressing like a duke, or an artisan's wife tried to wear the elaborate headdresses of a court lady? The ruling elite had an answer for that: sumptuary laws. These were regulations designed specifically to police people's appearance, ensuring that no one could look too beautiful or too rich for their social class. Sumptuary laws were an attempt by the nobility and royalty to keep class distinctions clear and visible at a time when those lines were beginning to blur. With the growth of cities and the rise of a wealthy merchant class, there were people with money, but no noble blood who could afford to buy the same luxury goods as the aristocracy. This posed a threat to the established social order. If anyone could look like a noble, how would you know who was truly important? Sumptuary laws were, in essence, a form of social protectionism, using clothing and appearance as a mandatory class uniform. These laws were incredibly specific and varied from city to city and kingdom to kingdom. They dictated who could wear what, based on their social standing or sometimes their annual income. For example, only royalty and the highest nobility might be allowed to wear certain types of fur, like ermine, the white winter coat of the stoat with its black-tipped tail, or sable. Expensive fabrics like velvet, silk, or brocade could be restricted to higher classes. Colors were also regulated. Certain dyes were extremely expensive and therefore laden with status. Tyrian purple, a deep purple derived from sea snails, was historically reserved for Roman emperors and still carried a connotation of supreme power. Scarlet, a vibrant red made from crushed insects, was also a sign of great wealth and could be forbidden for the lower classes. The regulations could extend to the smallest details of appearance. As we saw with the Krakow shoes, the length of the points was legally prescribed by class. The amount of fabric that could be used in a dress, the type of jewelry allowed, the use of gold or silver thread in embroidery, all of this could be subject to legislation. A law might stipulate that a merchant's wife could not wear more than 2 rings or a belt with a silver buckle, while a duchess could adorn herself with gold and precious stones. Enforcement of these laws was often difficult. City authorities could impose fines or even confiscate the offending garments from those who violated the codes. However, people often found ways around the rules and fashion continued to evolve, often in direct defiance of these restrictions. The human desire to express oneself and to improve one's social standing was a powerful force that constantly clashed with the elite's desire to maintain the status quo. These laws reveal the deep anxiety the elite felt about social mobility and identity. They show that beauty and fashion were not just matters of personal taste, but political battlegrounds. Your appearance was not just your own. It was a reflection of your God-ordained position in the world, and to deviate from it was to disrupt that order. For the medieval woman, this meant her pursuit of beauty was doubly restricted, first by the aesthetic ideals of the time, and second, by the laws that dictated which of those ideals she was permitted to pursue. She couldn't just adopt the latest fashion from Paris. She had to ask herself, am I entitled by my birth and station to wear this? Beauty was not a right, but a rigidly controlled privilege. We have reached the final section of our long and winding journey through medieval beauty standards. We have unearthed the secrets of lead-based pallor, plucked hairs in the name of high foreheads, felt the pain of teeth rotted by wealth, breathed the heavy air of perfumes masking a lack of bathing, and stumbled in absurdly pointed shoes. We have seen how beauty was a complex construction of status, religion, function, and fear. Now, as we prepare to leave this world of brutal and impossible ideals, it's time to ask, what happened to it all? And what does this toxic and fascinating legacy tell us about our own beauty standards today? The end of the Middle Ages and the advent of the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and the Age of Discovery brought with them seismic shifts in society, science, and culture, which inevitably reshaped ideals of beauty. The invention of the printing press allowed for a wider dissemination of ideas, including new concepts of health and aesthetics. The growing knowledge of anatomy and medicine began to cast doubt on practices like indiscriminate bloodletting. Contact with new cultures around the world introduced new fashions and cosmetics. Slowly, painfully, some of the most extreme standards began to fade. The vast plucked forehead gave way to softer, more natural hairstyles in the Renaissance. The pregnant virgin silhouette was replaced by tapered waists and voluminous skirts that required new types of corsets. Although the use of dangerous cosmetics like lead persisted for centuries, a new appreciation for color and vitality began to emerge, especially in art. The cadaverous pallor, while still valued, began to compete with the more robust and sensual ideal of beauty, as seen in the works of Titian or Rubens. However, the fundamental legacy of these medieval standards did not disappear. It simply changed form, echoing through the centuries to our own digital age. The idea that beauty requires suffering? It is still with us, whether in the pain of waxing, feet squeezed into high-heeled shoes, recovery from plastic surgery, or restrictive diets. The pursuit of a look that signifies status? Today, this can translate into designer labels, expensive skin treatments, or the display of a perfect lifestyle on social media. The use of potentially dangerous substances in the name of beauty? The cosmetics industry is still a minefield of controversial chemicals and exaggerated promises. The contrast between the beauty of the idle elite and the functional appearance of the working class also persists. Tanned skin, which in the Middle Ages was the mark of the peasant, became in the 20th century a sign of leisure and wealth, the ability to take exotic vacations. Today, the pendulum may be swinging back, with sun protection and pale skin being associated once again with care and sophistication. The fashion of looking ill or frail also has its modern echoes, from the heroin chic aesthetic of the 90s to certain trends that glorify extreme thinness. What the history of medieval beauty teaches us most profoundly is that these standards are never just about aesthetics. They are a reflection of the anxieties, values, and power structures of a society. Medieval ideals were brutal and impossible because medieval life was in many ways brutal and full of impossible contradictions. It was a world that longed for spiritual purity, but was obsessed with earthly lineage. It valued the strength of the warrior, but the delicacy of the lady. It was surrounded by death and disease, and so it romanticized fragility. As we look back at these practices that seem so barbaric to us, we are invited to look at our own beauty rituals with a more critical eye. Which of our current standards will seem absurd and dangerous to future generations? What poisons are we applying to our bodies or minds in pursuit of a fleeting ideal? The history of medieval beauty is a distant mirror, and in it, if we look closely, we can see a distorted but recognizable reflection of ourselves. And so, our journey through the vanity and venom of the Middle Ages comes to an end. We leave behind the high foreheads, the dark teeth, and the leaden skins. You are safe now, back in your own time, in your own bed. Feel the comfort of your pillow, the softness of your sheets. Feel the ease of your breath, free from corsets. Feel your skin, healthy and alive, free from poisons. The struggles of those men and women from a distant past are no longer yours. Their concerns were with survival, status, and salvation, expressed in the most painful forms of beauty. Your only task now is to relax. Let the shadows of history deepen and turn into sleep. Let the weight of the past anchor you in a deep and peaceful rest. There is nothing more to do, nothing more to prove. Just breathe and sleep.